Hey there, Harper. In the last letter, we came face to face with the issue that has caused most of the distrust and rancor between science and religion. How old is the Earth? Well, scientists say the Earth is billions of years old, but many believers think it's only a few thousand years old. Now, you know I've said several times that God made all of nature and inspired the writing of the Bible. So those two will always agree, even when our understanding of one or the other is faulty. And regarding the age of the Earth, I believe they do agree. But let me start with a personal story. 30 years ago, I was a sales manager for a very large company. I used the airlines a lot to get to appointments in different cities. I worked hard and was very dedicated to my company. I used early morning and evening flights so I could put in a full day's work. I was always tired when I'd get on the plane, and the first thing I'd do is pull out a magazine and start reading. Now, the real purpose of this was to signal to the person sitting beside me that I didn't want to talk. I'd be asleep before takeoff and wouldn't wake up until we were well into the flight. One time, the man sitting next to me wanted to chat, and for some reason, I decided to join in. Now, normally I would never let that happen, but this time I did. We compared notes for a few minutes on the obvious things, our jobs and travel schedules. He was a scientist. I've forgotten what specialty. Somehow, the discussion turned to creation and the Bible account. Well, I've forgotten everything that was said, but I've always remembered the way he finished our conversation. Here's what he said. We scientists all agree that the biblical account of creation accurately describes the sequence of events in the development of the earth and life on earth. But there's no way it happened in 6 days. Well, I had no response for that. I don't think I had ever even thought about that. The Bible clearly says that God created for 6 days and rested on the seventh day. Was the Bible wrong? Well, I was busy and soon forgot about it. But 30-some years later, I needed to know the answer to that question. Moses was a Hebrew, a Jew. But he had been raised as the grandson of the king of Egypt. He was highly educated and spoke Hebrew as well as the native language of Egypt. Moses wrote the book of Genesis around the year 1400 BCE. Ancient language scholars believe it was around the same time that Hebrew became a written language. Prior to that time, it was only a spoken language. And at that time, the written language only had about 3,000 words, not counting proper names and places. Well, compare that to English, which has 170,000 words in common use today. You can imagine then that one Hebrew word might have different meanings depending on the usage. And I'm convinced that's the root of the problem that we're dealing with today. The word that has caused all the controversy is day. So what does that word actually mean? Well, if I ask you the question, you might quickly answer 24 hours. And of course, that would be right. But it doesn't always mean that. Let me show you. Suppose I asked you to describe a telephone and tell me what you do with it. I'm sure you would pull out your iPhone and run through some of the apps. You might show me how many pictures or songs you have stored there. I'm 100% sure that you would not describe this. In fact, I doubt you've ever even seen one of these. Well, while you're studying this clunky thing, I might say, back in my day, this was how we made phone calls. And that was all we could do. No pictures, no weather, no maps, no music, and no texts. Now you might respond with something like, you sure are old, but you would not ask me which day I was referring to. You see, you would clearly understand that I was talking about a period of time in the past. There would not be any confusion about that. And yet, it's the same word with two very different meanings. And this, you see, is the problem. This is the Hebrew word yom, translated day in English. In ancient Hebrew, this one word was used 4 different ways. It identified all of the daylight hours, some part of the daylight hours, afternoon for example, a full 24-hour day, as well as some finite period of time in the past. Well, we have separate words to identify morning, afternoon, evening, and night. But even today, we commonly use this word in 3 of those ways. Here are some examples. What a hard job. It took all day. Now, you don't know exactly how long I worked. You might assume I worked from dawn to dusk, but you would not assume that I worked 24 hours straight. Now, suppose I tell you that Mimi went on a short trip and I say she was gone for 3 days. Well, we all know that means most or all of 3 24-hour days. And like we were talking about with the phones, when I say back in my day, you know I'm talking about many days. You'd never think I was talking about just one day. In fact, you'd probably assume I was referring to several years. So what we've just considered is exactly the same thing that Moses did. He used one word to express different ideas. And how can I be sure of this? Well, Moses himself shows us. Let's look at 2 verses, Genesis 1:5 and 2:4. In Genesis 1:5 we see, "And God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening and the morning were the first day." Now, before we talk about the word itself, let me explain these blue numbers. An Old Testament scholar named Strong assigned a number to every key word in the original Hebrew text. So when we read the English version with his numbers, everywhere we see the number H3117, we know that the Hebrew word in the original text was yom. So looking at chapter 1, verse 5, the first use of the word yom refers to the daylight hours only. But the next use of the same word refers to both daylight and nighttime hours. So in just this one verse, we've seen the word used 2 different ways. In chapter 2, verse 4, Moses is summarizing what he has already described in chapter 1. While he called the creation steps days in chapter 1, here he calls each of those steps a generation, and then refers to all those generations as the day. So we have seen the word yom, or day, used 3 different ways in just the first 2 chapters. And not only that, but what Moses called a day in chapter 1, he called a generation in chapter 2. In our day, a generation might be 30 or 40 years. In his day, it was probably much more. It was certainly not one 24-hour day. I've come to accept my seatmate's conclusion that the earth is very old and was not created in 6 24-hour days. Moses was using the word yom, or day, in the context of a long period of time in the past. Besides the obvious usage of the word in different ways, there's a few more reasons. Number one, while Moses was highly educated, the people he was leading were not. They had just left Egypt, where for a large part of 400 years they had been slaves. They were uneducated and illiterate. Moses was not writing this to give them a scientific explanation of Earth's origins. He was telling them and their descendants, as well as you and me, this is how big your God is. This is the God who destroyed Egypt and parted the Red Sea so you could cross on dry land. The second reason, the scientific evidence we have today points most strongly to an old Earth. And since I believe that both nature and the Bible must agree and that God is not going to trick us, the day-age model makes the most sense to me. And then there's the first verse of the Bible. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Notice that the creation of the heavens and the earth occurred before the first day. There's not the slightest hint in this verse about how long that took. This verse could refer to 1 second, but it could just as easily be 10 billion years. There are two other verses in other parts of the Bible that reference how God relates to time. Psalm 90 verse 4 says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night." And 2 Peter 3:8 says, "With the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day." We see from these two verses that time, as we know it, means nothing to God. And that makes sense when you think about it. I mean, after all, if you're eternal, what's a billion years? That's kind of like asking you about 5 seconds. And finally, as we saw in the letter on the cosmos, the Creator must be outside of the creation. He's bigger than the creation and not confined by the creation. The Scripture says that God is eternal. He has always been and always will be. Well, so far we've looked at the evidence for the existence of God from cosmology. We took a side trip through geology and linguistics to eliminate the controversy over the age of the earth. In the next letter, we'll take a look at the very special nature of our world through the lens of physics. So that's all for today. I know you'll be home in a couple of days. We're anxious to see you. I guess we'll all still be wearing masks, but that'll be better than not getting together at all. Be careful driving home. Remember, I love you.